I want to be able to see somebody there, so I don't feel like I'm all alone there. I've got it back. That's um, so. Thanks everyone for participating in this. An introduction to myself. I'm the executive director of A Better Life Foundation, and I run a charity that feeds about 1,500 people every day. Essentially, the core of all of the work that we do is trying to break down the walls of isolation in our neighborhood through food. And we recognize that food is certainly not the only barrier to isolation. In fact, I don't even know if it's the top tier, but it's what we're able to do and what we're able to do with a lot of pride. And we put that intention behind all of our meals, recognizing that people, since societies have become societies, have connected over food and have connected over the dining room tables and have joined celebrations over food and mourned losses over food, and everything in between. So we recognize that food can be a really powerful conduit to bring people together. And we also recognize that our community needs that togetherness as much or as any other community, if not more. Our community is suffering, and I'm sure everyone has an impression of that. So how do we bring people together through food? Of course, recognizing the social aspect of it for sure. But we also host 2 dinners a week that bring folks from our neighborhood into our dining space for something that is decidedly not a soup kitchen. And I always say that with hesitation because soup kitchens are fantastic and keep a lot of people alive. As much as we are proud of the food, that it's very much a food driven event, it is as much about the social aspect of it. So it's a warmly lit environment with good music playing, and it is meant to facilitate connection as much as it is to provide meals. So our objectives aren't exactly the same as a soup kitchen, but and our meals are also made by folks from our community. So they have a lot of lived experience to the same demographic that we're serving, and have that empathy and relatability to it. And in every food and every aspect of anything we produce, we put a lot of love and intention into that, because we do believe that not only is food going to be a great connector, it also can help people pursue upward mobility, which I think is very linked to socialization, which I'll prove there. But that only really works if the food is more than just sustenance, and it is food that people making it, delivering it, and certainly consuming it are proud of. And that objective is not met with food that's made just to sustain. I'm sure everybody in this room has an impression of the downtown east side. Positive ones, likely some negative ones. And but it's something that we're all familiar with, and something comes to mind when we think of this. And I know a lot of people are very familiar with the strength and resiliency of our community. It's something that comes up often. People from outside the community are aware of, as I say, of the strength of our community. But if the community is so tight knit, why is there still so much suffering? Is a question I ask myself all the time. I've seen more support within our community than I have in any other community I've been a part of. And I've been a part of some pretty generous communities. And I don't just mean nonprofits offering support to the people that they serve. I mean internal community support, people looking out for each other. And frankly, I think that comes from a need of survival. If the community is not going to take care of itself, they have learned that they can't depend on others, or they might be able to depend on them for some things, but they need to have that strength in community. But again, the question is, well, then how is there still so much suffering? And the big ones, of course, come down to mental health and addiction. Those are factors that I think, despite the strength, are going to lead to some really challenging circumstances to overcome. And there's a lot of conversation with some really powerful thought leaders about are these causes of isolation or are these symptoms? I'm proposing that they are symptoms of isolation. And while it's a very complicated web and one that I don't think I'm qualified to pull apart, recognize that that these aren't the only factors that are leading to each other, and the things that I'm hoping to address in the rest of my presentation aren't going to necessarily circumnavigate these issues and be the forever answers. However, I think they're a great step forward, and there's lots of evidence for it. So I want us to really understand the crisis that we're dealing with too, I think, before we move on. And when we're talking about isolation in our community, these are the most recent numbers that we're able to produce. And the convergences of crises in our neighborhood is been more apparent than ever before. And it's important to realize it's intersectional. These numbers, I won't read them off. They speak for themselves. But I also want to recognize that when we combine this with, of course, the opioid crisis, but as well as the housing crisis, and a housing crisis that is just unimaginable, really, when you think about the fact that for some reason, and I'm not going to get into the conspiracy theories, but we've had shelters and SROs burned down at an unprecedented rate. We're talking about at least 500 people that have been displaced in 2022, beyond the increasing input of people needing housing support. It paints a grim picture. And I'm not a grim person. I'm an optimist, and a passionate optimist. And I believe that there are some really tenable and attractive solutions out here. But we have to recognize the climate that we're in if we're going to really genuinely tackle the isolation in our neighborhood, the isolation that is just exasperated by those two factors. No surprise here, but access to adequate and safe housing is a key component into breaking isolation in our community. And it's not easy. I'm not saying that, by tomorrow we could have this solved, but we do have the answers to the housing crisis, and we at least have more temporary solutions than what we're witnessing right now. And we've got some not great solutions, and I will get kind of diverging a little bit into opinion rather than fact here. But one of the conversations that's happening is perhaps that we have smaller satellites, more manageable tent cities in municipal spaces that are vacant and have the capacity for it. I get how that is better than what we're having right now, but it's still a tent city in the elements, and I almost see it as conceding that we aren't choosing to do the real solutions. And a lot of advocates are suggesting small houses, tiny homes, which I do think is quite excellent. It gives people their own personal space, the agency to lock their door when they have to go do things and not worry about the security of their space. But again, I'm not a housing expert, so I'm not going to go into. I'm going to leave it there. But culture and language, colonization has ravaged a large percentage of the people in our community of their culture, and there is another growing population of people that are relatively new to Canada and don't have access to express themselves in their language adequately. And of course, basic human needs. And this is where I think we come in, a Better Life Foundation, that is, but lots of other groups as well. We provide the basic human need through food, but other people do it, of course, through shelter and clothing and the other things that you would see there. And as they intersect all, I think there is a solution to, again, break down these walls of isolation. And I do think it's through meaningful employment. Where these three things converge and we actually reconnect people with all of these is through meaningful employment. I presume that all of us are at least relatively gainfully employed in some capacity on this conversation. That's why you're participating in this awesome exercise. But a lot of the folks that I've worked with and get to hang out with and serve are suffering from a significant loss of identity that comes from not having meaningful employment. And meaningful employment, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, but I would define as not make work. This isn't go have a job that doesn't need to be done and paid an honorarium. Not there's nothing wrong with being paid honorariums, but is more so to get people working rather than doing something meaningful. And at our organization, a Better Life Foundation, which I can speak to very personally, but there's a lot of great organizations doing very similar work. 75% of our team identifies as having a barrier to employment and credits our organization as being their opportunity to re-enter the workforce, or in some cases enter it for the first time. And the sense of identity that people get from regular, dependable, not token, but meaningful work can't be understated. In our society, it is not uncommon for the second question after what is your name to be followed up with what do you do? And not being able to answer that can often be really dehumanizing. People want a sense of purpose and a sense of identity that they often get through work. Of course, it goes without saying that independence is critical to the sense of belonging and not having to feel like you're relying on other people, and giving people that financial independence, of course, intersects with all of the issues that I brought up on the previous slide. Virtually all, except for some of the staff that have been with us for less than a year, have gone out to find market housing in the first year of living with us. They've left SROs, they've left supportive housing, and are living in places that bring them peace and safety and comfort. I mean, as we all know, finding adequate housing in Vancouver is a challenge no matter what, but especially so, if not just completely impossible, if you're on social assistance and unable to earn your own money. It's just it's a fact. It's a binary situation. But of course, positive socialization. The other aspect of it is, and we've all certainly been familiar with this over the last couple of years, of the benefits that we have with or miss by not being able to interact with colleagues. I know the big theme of this whole conversation we're having today is about how we've all become first degree related to isolation throughout the last couple of years and how it's affected our mental health. That isolation we're referring to has been something that's been a factor in our neighborhood, in our community, long before anyone's heard of the pandemic. And unfortunately will remain so until we're able to kind of tackle these things. And again, I guess my whole thesis in this is that while there's multiple ways to approach impacting some of these factors, meaningful employment is I think one of the best, because it covers so many of the factors simultaneously. Laura, I see that things are happening in the chat. I'm not observing it because my screen is there. Should I come to it after?
I just wanted to wait for you to finish your sentence, but Joshua just said, can you repeat the number of people leaving for their own housing, if that makes sense?
Our organization?
I think
in our organization, 100% have done so after 1 year of employment. We have people that have been with us for less than a year and are still living in subsidized or supportive housing.
Awesome.
But everybody else within our organization that's been there for longer than a year has usually living with roommates or something of the sort. But I mean, that's a classic Vancouver story for a lot of people that are living in the city. The other aspect about meaningful employment is that it does a lot of critical work that needs to be done in the city and frankly has a hard time filling. You know, when we look at the overdose prevention sites, those are peer driven by or largely peer driven, and they're literally saving people on the front lines of the opioid epidemic. It's incredible work that they're doing, and meaningful, and akin to paramedics, literally saving lives. Our neighborhood, and I know I'm sure a lot of us have some feelings on what Hastings Street looks like right now, but is only in the condition that it's in because peers have been keeping it clean through micro employment and honorarium jobs. The city's engineering department used to maintain it, and I don't know if everyone's aware of what came to be to get us into our most recent situation, but it's a long story and I won't get into it, but essentially engineering is not doing its cleanups of Hastings Street anymore, and is now being done by the community. And I recognize that, I operated a business in that neighborhood, that things could and have been a lot better, but they would be extremely worse if our community wasn't doing this through their own employment. Through Megaphone, Megaphone's a publication where people from our neighborhood are able to be paid for their stories and their communication and their art. The examples are numerous and important. And it's really important that this work, as I say, the risk of repeating myself, is meaningful. It's not just tokenism work. None of this is. It's critical to keeping our neighborhood not just in the situation, but to break the status quo. I also deal with people through these events that we get. Twice a week, we have volunteers come into our space, and they come from all walks of life in all areas of the Lower Mainland, and sometimes, often, I think there's a lot of voices and a lot of perspectives that share this, but don't often verbalize it. But occasionally someone verbalizes, is this situation savable? Is this not past repair? And we've seen through the employment, not just in our organization, but with the peers that we work with, Binners, Megaphone, OPS, Atira, Portland Hotel Society, the numerous agencies that are hiring peers in our community. Embers is another great example, that this is the absolute key. It's internal into helping people rise up out of their situation and solve these situations themselves. I've got absolute confidence that our neighborhood and our community and our city is savable, but it needs to be saved by the people that are living in it themselves. There is no external factor that can come in. However, there's lots of ways that externally we can help those agencies to help them do more work and help them continue to bring each other up out of their situation and pursue upward mobility. And that's where we are. Is that exactly 11:20?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Well, I won't rush to fill my 2 minutes. Maybe we've got some extra questions.
Oh, yeah, you have 7 minutes actually.
Oh,
I
sorry.
apologize.
Yeah, you have some time.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm at the at the end. I thought it was 11:20.
Does anyone have any questions for Ash? One question comes from Joshua. He says, what are Binners and Embers?
Excellent. Hi, Joshua. Binners are a very great, that's a great way to add some context to this. Thanks for the question. Binners originally started as an organization that literally dumpster dove, and they would extract resources through recycling, not just of refundables, but of precious metals, or maybe precious is a little extreme, but copper and other things that you'd find in the waste. And they essentially unionized and became a self-governing organization. And now through a social enterprise project, have major clients like the Vancouver Convention Center, the PNE. I'm proud to consider ourselves a client. They come in twice a week and do waste sorting, which not only helps diversion incredibly, as hard as our staff try, they just aren't professionals at it. But the binners certainly are professionals, and they sort your waste and make sure it's all going to the right place. And where possible, of course, extract value into having it re-enter the market. They're also campaigning to create these shared use carts where binners can rent them out like a library, and they're heavy industrial carts for moving things around. And it's a very interesting low barrier employment opportunity, because to be a binners member, the only obligation is you attend one of 3 meetings. They have a monthly meeting, and I think you have to attend one every 3 months to kind of maintain your status. It's really excellent. It's a very important aspect of economic development and a model to be carried on to. Embers is another great organization who gets people from the community, usually with some sort of barrier, physical or mental disability, I think is one of the more common, working primarily in the construction industry. Another thing I didn't mention in the presentation that I was hoping to was how there is a incredible job shortage. I sit on a group called the President's Group, which has some of the leaders of British Columbia's top companies, and universally, there are people that are all these organizations and all these firms are suffering from a labor shortage at all levels. And we have a completely employable workforce that often, maybe takes a slight bit of accommodation. But one thing I didn't mention is, in our experience, we have a retention rate that's unheard of by our peers. And we've been working in the food and beverage industry for, cumulatively decades and decades. And turnover's massive. I mean, I bet you a third or more of the people on this call at some point has worked in the restaurant industry and no longer do. It's not something people consider their careers. So to get people, gainfully employed people, that it actually becomes their career rather than a job they're doing during school is super powerful. So there's also that excellent angle to this sort of employment. And I also encourage you to look up both Benners and Embers and hear it from their own perspective. They're incredible organizations, but just some of many. Mission Possible are also doing very similar work, and again, critically keeping our neighborhood livable and as clean as can be, considering that it's actually become people's bedrooms and everything else.
Well, if no one has any other questions, or if you do, just pop them in the chat really quickly. But thank you so much, Ash. That was very informative. Oh man, what an amazing morning. I feel like super energized by this. Yeah, just to recap, if you have the link for Binners and Embers, you can send that in the chat as well. But we really appreciate you being here and giving us all this super valuable information.
My pleasure. I'm really happy that in this climate of talking about isolation, that we can represent our heavily isolated neighborhood, because it's not always at the top of conversation. So including in the conversation is super important, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do so. And I will send both Embers and the Binners link after I stop sharing my screen.